Good afternoon, folks. I'm here just a smidge early, so I'll go ahead and take attendance and let other people roll in. Okie dokie. So just a couple announcements. One is that midterm progress reports are supposed to go up tomorrow. There are some people who are still missing big things who are in this class. So a couple people, well, more than a couple, maybe about a third of the class has yet to turn in your midterm. And I would say a good half of you have yet to do the midterm participation. So I've been waiting to see who else would turn stuff in. If you are not at the point where you're able to turn any of that in, that's fine. I will turn in your midterm reports probably around 3 today. So obviously that's not very much time after class. And I'll just put a note if it doesn't include something big like that and say, you know, like this is probably flip the grade or whatever. This is just a thing we do. I've literally never heard of another college that does them. I'm sure that there are. It's a little weird that we do them. I think they can be helpful. And so I do try to do them for all my students. But also I'll just say nothing should be surprising because I just go with your Blackboard grade. And like, it's not like the end of the year where I'll round up. So let me, it'll just literally be whatever grades on on your midterm. And someone asked me in the chat, I'm pretty sure I turned in my midterm eval, but I can't remember. Go ahead and shoot me an email if you don't see a grade for midterm participation, and I'll go in and check that. If you're someone who can process more than one thing at once, you should be able to turn in the midterm eval while I talk today. It's pretty quick. And honestly, like if you're pretty quick at being self-reflective, you could probably fill it out in about 30 seconds or so. I would guess max 5 minutes. So let me grab that link and I'll throw that in the chat for those of you who haven't been able to do it yet. Just one sec, because I think, yeah, because I'm the editor, it's giving me a different link than y'all. So let me give you the right link. That would be helpful. And for this class in particular, the self-eval is going to be super helpful because we don't necessarily get a ton of time to do participation when we're all together. But I know that y'all are doing a lot of that in your small groups when we do the assignments. And so I've been people who have turned them in, I've been finding that really helpful when you're reflective about, you know, sort of how things go for you in the small groups, in the breakout rooms. So Yeah, like I said, I'm gonna try to get those in. I have a meeting at 3:30 and then I have like another meeting at 6:30. So I'm gonna try to get them in before that 3:30 meeting. And then they should be posted tomorrow. Again, these don't actually go into your GPA or anything. They're just sort of a heads up, how's everything going? The other quick thing is just to think about what we do have coming up due. So there are several things that will be coming up. So I'm just opening the syllabus real quick to make sure I have the dates right, since I did change those at one point. So a week from today, on the 29th, your interview paper is due. So this is not meant to be overwhelming. You basically just interview someone and then tie it to things you've been talking about in class. And one thing with this is typically I want this to be someone at the organization you're volunteering with. I know a lot of you are having to do very different things with that, using previous engagements, what have you. So it doesn't have to be someone at your organization. It can be anyone who's tied somehow to the law or psychology, that can, you can formatively relate what they tell you to the rest of what we've been talking about in class. So if you can't volunteer with a police officer, but they can give you an interview and you want to do that, that's great. Even if you're volunteering with someone totally different. And then after that, your next big thing you'll be having due is not due for a month. And then that is the service learning paper. So that'll be the paper where you just reflect on your time with your organization and tie that to class. And then during our scheduled exam time, you'll give a very brief presentation about that. Just to give you an idea of what these presentations are like. The last time I taught this class, obviously we could be in person, and we were in the social science lab, and we literally just sat in a big circle and just went around the circle, and everyone just like chatted for 5 minutes about their paper. So they're pretty chill, but it's just a nice way to sort of hear what your classmates got the chance to do, and learn from them. So I'm just giving people credit who are signing in. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Okay, any questions about stuff coming up? There will be more group assignments. These two chapters, the ones about assessments, are just like, I got a lecture, I got to fill stuff in that the book doesn't cover. But we will be doing more group assignments, starting with stuff about juries. We're going to watch 12 Angry Men when we talk about jury deliberations and do some stuff related to that. So thank you all for sort of bearing with me through this lecture heavy part of the class. It's not always my favorite part to do, but like I said, hopefully the material is interesting enough. But any questions about what we have coming up for the class in general? All right, the only other thing I will say is, typically either this week or last week would be spring break, and clearly we're not getting that. And I know that we're all burned out and we're all tired, right? And so just take care of yourselves. If you need to, take an afternoon where you just nap, do that, right? If you need to, when the weather starts getting nicer, take an afternoon or a morning where you just go to the beach and sit for an hour, do that. Like, just take care of yourselves, because this year's a marathon. But I feel like it's a marathon that we're being forced to do at sprint pace, which, is not healthy, obviously. So just, take good care of yourselves. All right, I'm going to go ahead and open up our PowerPoint here. Oh, looks like I might have a question in the elevator. Oh, yeah. I mean, there's part of me that like wishes I would have just scheduled in a spring break. I should have done that. But yeah, we're all trying to squish everything in, and some of it goes okay and some of it doesn't. So I totally empathize, Casita. Alrighty. So I'm going to put this in presentation mode, and then I will turn on the captions and pull this over here so that we can chat about everything here. So we spent last week talking about, I think, what we typically think of. Oh, sorry, Jace, you're just seeing my dress. It's a cute dress, but it's better to see my face. So what we typically think of when we think of psychologists being involved in the legal system is what we talked about last week, right? Like we tend to think of psychologists assessing criminals and doing all that really exciting stuff. And that is not to say anything we're going to talk about today is not as exciting. Sometimes it's even like much more dramatic, honestly. But doing these types of civil assessments isn't necessarily on our radar in the same way. So again, that's why this is just straight lecture for 2 days to really fill everything in for you and add some insights. And I apologize, I should have said this last week. Every once in a while, you're going to see me kind of looking this direction and getting slightly distracted. My next door neighbor's got a dachshund puppy, and so they have to take it out a lot. And so whenever I see him, I get a little distracted because he's really cute. So I could see him out the window here. Alrighty. So we're going to start by talking about domestic relations. And this is a civil branch of the judicial system. So the civil system is what we typically think of when we think of lawsuits, things along those lines. We're not talking about crimes, but it also incorporates things like divorce court and things along those lines. So there are no juries here. All the decisions are going to be made by a judge or an assistant acting for the judge. And so depending on your jurisdiction, that can be someone who's called a referee or a magistrate. Basically, these folks will do the trial and then they just can't sign off. The judge will have to like officially sign the paperwork, but they do everything else. So like when you go for a civil proceeding, you might have one of these people and you might not even know necessarily they're not a judge, right? Unless you've done your research, because they're going to do everything else just the way a judge would. Decisions from these courts are technically appealable, but this is rarely done. It's unlikely that it will be overturned, and it's not like other court systems where it might like elevate to a different level, and so you'd have a different judge. Like you're just going to probably see the same judge or referee again. So they're probably not necessarily going to make a different decision unless there's new evidence. All right, so probably the most common of these that psychologists are involved in are custody evaluations. And so these, I have to say, I've never done one myself, but my grad advisor, Dr. Jen Crowther, these are what she would pick up, like to keep her assessment skills sharp and her clinical skills sharp. And she would tell me just how difficult they were, because you're trying to make like the best decision for the family, and it's not always obvious, right, what that is. And it's just heartbreaking sometimes what these kids have had to go through. So I'm kind of glad I never had to do one of these because it just sounds really emotionally draining. At the same time, the other side of that token is we need people to do these and do these well, right? Because these are really important decisions. And often the psychologist's evaluation is one of the most informative things during child custody hearings. So one of the things we need to designate is legal versus physical custody. So legal custody means that you would make all the decisions related to the child and be responsible for the child legally. So you would decide like where the kid goes to school and things along those lines. Physical custody is where the child actually lives. So which parent or guardian do they reside with? And obviously, often these things would be paired, but not always. You can also have joint custody, where each parent has equal authority to make decisions about the child, even though they are separated or divorced. And you, even if you grant physical custody to one parent, you can grant visitation, or essentially access of the non-custodial parent to the child. So the parent that the kid doesn't live with, what access do they get? There will be some cases where that other parent has been abusive or maybe is in prison, right? Where they just will get no visitation, no custody rights at all. But this examination of access of the non-custodial parent to the child through visitation, etc., is often a part of these evaluations and these decisions. So most courts tend to have standard visitation schedules, and that will just vary from area to area based on like what they tend to use. So for example, when I took my graduate level version of this course when I was in grad school, Jack Graham told us that, you know, the courts in that area at that time, it was like the non-custodial parent got every Tuesday and Thursday from 6 to 9 p.m. and then every other weekend from 6 p.m. Friday to 6 p.m. Sunday. Like that was their standard schedule they used. But again, that'll vary based on the court, etc. And then there's also temporary versus permanent custody. So for temporary custody, this would often be during the proceedings, right? So while you're going through trial, where's the kid gonna live? This is almost always given to the mother. There are still a lot of antiquated ideas about gender and parenting in our system. In fact, one of the cases that Ruth Bader Ginsburg argued before the Supreme Court while she was still a lawyer was actually about a father trying to get legal rights to his kids. And so I think that's one of the things that really like endeared her to people, is because she was like, no, I'm not just saying this to like benefit women, right? We need equal rights across the board. Temporary, again, because of ideas, right? And sometimes the mom just is the primary caregiver, right? Either they're a stay-at-home mom, or like we see with this pandemic, the moms are much more likely to be working from home with their kids, et cetera, et cetera. And then whoever has temporary custody, again, typically the mom, has rights to make decisions about the kids, even if like they're still going through divorce proceedings, for example. So then there's permanent custody, and this is never actually permanent and unchanging. So after 12 months, it can be reopened, or you can reopen it at any time if the kids are in danger. So let's say, you know, full legal and physical custody has been granted to the mother, and then you find out the mother has been abusing them, right? Or, you know, maybe the mother passes away. And then, you know, then we've got to reevaluate, right? Yes, Emily, yes. Thank you for chiming in with this. This is such a good point. So when someone issues a protective order, so this is sometimes called like a no contact order, or a restraining order, depending on your municipality. Temporary custody is also granted to the petitioner when a child's involved in well. So whoever says my spouse was abusing me and I don't want them near me, they get temporary custody. Yes, that's a really good point. Basically, the court is trying to protect the kiddos as much as possible. And sometimes that's not really clear how you do that well, right? But in a case like Emily is highlighting, it seems pretty obvious, like, let's not grant custody to the abuser, right? Of course, that gets trickier if it's mutual abuse, which happens, unfortunately, quite a bit. So for some cohorts, about 40% of marriages end in divorce. And I've heard this range all the way from like a third of marriages up to half of marriages, depending on the statistic you look at. And about a third to a half of couples who divorce have kids under 18. If your kids are over 18, you don't have to do a custody agreement, right? Because they are custodians of themselves. They are legally in charge of themselves. So in that case, they come under the jurisdiction of domestic relations court, and custody has to be approved by the court. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to go through a really long trial about it. About 70 to 90%, so most divorcing parents by far, reach an agreement about custody, either joint custody or, again, one of them being the custodial parent and the other with some visitation rights, or not at all. Therefore, mental health professionals are not involved in most custody cases. So most custody cases, they would not have to go through a psych eval. Even the ones that are contested, you aren't typically going to have a custody eval because, again, at some point, they're going to just come to an agreement. So psychologists get involved in the toughest cases, which is why it gets even harder to do this sort of emotionally, right? And they get involved to help the trier of fact make decisions. So their job is to report back to that judge, that magistrate, that referee. Here is the information I gathered from my assessment process. Based on that, here might be the best decision we can make about what it's not always the parents, right? It might be this child should live with their grandparents because they're more stable. That actually happened to the great gymnast Simone Biles, right? So her mother unfortunately abused drugs. And so she was placed into foster care. And when her grandparents found out, they came and got her. And eventually they adopted her. And so she actually calls them mom and dad because that's who they are to her. So, there are times when it's not either parent, and that's important to keep in mind as well. Now, interestingly, attorneys and judges don't place great value on mental health testimony in custody cases, but they do respect these reports that are made. So again, here is another scenario where rather than the dramatic scenes we see in movies and on TV where you're in court arguing passionately as a witness, you're probably like in your office typing up a report and making sure everything is unimpeachable in court, right? So not that glamorous, but very, very important. So what is the justification for involving psychologists at all? Why on earth should we do this? Well, there's a couple different laws that come into play here. So one is the Uniform Marriage and Divorce Act from 1979. And this is a set of guidelines that were made by a group representing all 50 states. And custody decisions are made in the best interest of the child. That's the main crux of this. Custody decisions are made in the best interest of the child. That's the guiding principle of this law. And to be honest, the guiding principle of everyone involved in terms of the psychologist, the magistrate, the judge, whomever. And that's based on a number of factors, including the mental and physical health of all individuals involved. So because it says the mental and physical health of all individuals involved, that justifies the involvement of psychologists in this practice, in this process. So this can include the wishes of the parents, of the child themselves, the interaction of the family, the child's adjustment to the home, the school, and their community. Then there's the Michigan Child Custody Act, which originally was created in 1970 and then revised in 1993. And this really is a model for state laws and standards that a lot of other states have modeled their laws on. And they really spelled out what is the best interest of the child. So they said the best interest of the child should be based on love, affection, and emotional ties between the parents and the child. And how do you figure this out? You talk to the kids, you talk to the parents, you observe them together, things along those lines. So love, affection, and emotional ties. The capacity and disposition of parents to give the child love, affection, and guidance. And also continuation of education, And then also raising the child in a religion or creed if the family has one. So it's not a requirement, but if that's something that's important to the family, that would be something that could be a piece of it. Okay, so just got a comment about custody situation specifically in Virginia Beach. There's a guardian ad litem, or GAL, appointed for the child, who is a lawyer who represents the child and does their own evaluations on the situation so they can make recommendations to the judge. That's great. The judge takes the guardian ad litem's recommendations very seriously and usually rules in favor of their opinion. That is fantastic. The other thing that I know lots of court systems have, and I believe Virginia Beach, Norfolk, and Chesapeake at least each have their own, is a child advocate system. And so the CASA thing that I sent out earlier in the semester, that is what that involves. So if you are involved in that, essentially you are assigned to the child as they go through the whole case, and you're not a lawyer, you're not doing evaluations per se, but you're just that child's advocate. You're with them for every step of that court proceeding, you support them, you are the person that advocates for them throughout the process. Yeah, thank you for the information. That's really helpful to know how it works around here, and really, really good to know that in Virginia Beach, they really listen to that guardian ad litem. That's great. And Hayden, it's so cool that your mom does that. So let's see. Other things they look at are the capacity and disposition of the parent to provide the child with basic necessities, food, clothing, medical care, other material needs. And then the length of time the child has lived in a stable, satisfactory environment and desirability of maintaining that continuity. This becomes critical in many cases, and the court is often reluctant to interrupt parent-child relationships that are going well, right? So if this child has been living with mom for years, they're established in the school system there, they have friends in the neighborhood, the judge isn't going to be like, let's up and move them, unless there's good cause. The permanence as a family unit of the home, right? So do they have an established residence? One of the things we want to look at, especially with the economy having gone up and down so much in the past year, is, are they homeless, right? Do they have a place to live? Does that place have adequate space? And do they have adequate resources to keep the child safe in that environment? They look at what they call the moral fitness of both parties, which is a nice euphemism for essentially making sure they're not criminals or abusers, things along those lines. Then, just like the Uniform Marriage and Divorce Act, there is a line specifically about mental and physical health of the parties involved. And so mental health makes a lot of intuitive sense to us, but what about physical health? Well, let's say, the parent is currently hospitalized long-term for something, right? Or they have a very young child and, they are paralyzed. That doesn't mean they can't have custody, but it means that there needs to be, someone else in the household, a caregiver, etc., who can help the parent when they need to do things physically with the child. And in fact, disability rights activists, this is one place they've really had to struggle, is sort of saying just because someone has a physical disability doesn't mean they can't be a good parent, right? They look at the home, school, and community record of the child. How's the child doing? They also look at the reasonable preferences of the kiddo themselves. If the court deems the child to be of sufficient age to express preference, and that's going to vary from municipality to municipality what that age is. But typically part of your assessment process as a psychologist would be trying to feel that out. And then the willingness and ability of the parents to encourage a close parent-child relationship between the child and the other parent. Again, as long as it's safe and appropriate. And then any other factor the court deems relevant, which I love, like, and other stuff. And oftentimes phrases like that are included in laws because there are things you can't anticipate that will actually be important and relevant. Alrighty, so let's say you are the psychologist that has been assigned a custody evaluation. You've got to do the psychological evaluation to determine who should have custody of this kiddo. So what Jack Graham told us is that your goal here is to provide information to the court to help in determining custody and visitation arrangements. So you're providing information to help with that decision. And those arrangements will most likely assure that the child's present and future needs are met. So again, it's not perfect. We're trying to find the best situation to place the child in. So providing information can take on a lot of different forms. Typically, there's going to be at least a report, right, that you write for the court. And then assuring that present and future needs are met, right? That gets a little tricky too. What does that mean? You've got to find out what that particular child needs, right? So some of it's obvious, some of it's stuff every kid will need, right? They need a bed to sleep in, they need food, right? They need to be able to get to school, things along those lines. But there are other things that will differ from family to family. So there are universal: safety, education, love, security, stability, guidance, right? Every kiddo needs that. And then there might be some unique ones. And what can be problematic is, let's say there's multiple kids in the family, they can have different needs, each of them, right? Depending. So that can kind of be a challenge. And sometimes you will end up with a case where there's split custody. Sort of a, what is that movie? Where Lindsay Lohan is her own twin. Parent Trap. There we go. A Parent Trap situation. And obviously there was an OG version of that too. Things that you might take into account for these unique needs of the kid include special education, physical disability, developmental delays, medical treatment, psychological treatment, and if a certain parenting style is necessary given the kid's needs. And then future is, what will the kids need as they get older, and will that parent still be able to provide that? So then what are the roles for psychologists in this situation? Well, there's lots of possibilities here, right? One is no role. Some people argue psychologists should not be involved here. Naila, I agree. The Haley Mills, I think it was one, was a little too cheesy for me. So I'm with you on your unpopular opinion about the Better Parent Trap. But yeah, what role should psychologists have? Some people say no role. They shouldn't be involved. They have nothing special to offer. That's really hard to argue when we look both at that national and the state law. Mental health is part of the criteria, right? So you need someone who is a mental health professional to help do those assessments. Some argue that they should essentially just serve as an investigator and report facts and offer no opinions at all. Just their report should be unbiased, no opinion. Others say they should offer opinions about factors identified in child custody statutes. So something like the mental health of that person, but offer no opinions about the actual custody arrangements. And then some say that psychologists should offer opinions about the custody and or visitation arrangements in the best interest of the child. So here the psychologist would be offering opinions on the ultimate issue, right? The issue that the judge is going to decide. Just like we talked about for NGRI, right? That the psychologist
may or may not be allowed to give opinions on the ultimate issue. In most cases, the court in that municipality will determine what role the psychologist has. And the psychologist will know that, particularly if they are hired by the court, right, to do these evaluations. They will know what the parameters of that are. A really important piece of this is that the assessor needs to be competent not only in assessment in general, but in particular to assess the needs of children. They need to have experience and training in child psychology. So I would not be qualified to do these without additional training. I mean, hey, I'm not licensed, but let's say I was licensed. Because my PhD focused on adult psychopathology, so I only took one class in grad school about child psychopathology. My friends who were child psychologists in the same program as me had to take, I think, 3 or 4 additional classes to learn more about development and what's normal at each stage of development in terms of pathology, and how to assess kids, right? Because that's different than adults who can fully participate most of the time. So these should really only be done by people who have pretty specialized training. So the APA does offer guidelines specific to custody evaluations in divorce proceedings. So the American Psychological Association put out these guidelines that said, here's what you should do if you're going to do these types of evaluations. So the APA says that the purpose of the evaluation is to assist in determining the psychological best interest of the child. So again, makes it really clear that we're not the ones who are making the final decision, fully acknowledging that is a job for the referee or judge. The child's welfare is paramount. That is the biggest thing you should be focusing on during this. It kind of doesn't matter what the parents want, right? It's what's going to be best for the child. The evaluation should focus on parenting attributes, the child's psychological needs, and the resulting fit between parent and child needs. So it starts with the needs of the child and then looks at the related parenting characteristics and which is the best fit for that child's needs. And as I've already mentioned, usually there's no perfect solution. It unfortunately sort of ends up being the lesser of 2 evils in some scenarios. So psychologists strive to gain and maintain specialized competence, as I just mentioned, in this area. So they need to have training, they need to have awareness of the laws in that jurisdiction, right? So that's really important, but there's no set, like, here's what that entails. Each individual psychologist decides like what that competence training means to them. And typically your employer will tell you what that means to them and hit that and maybe go above it. Psychologists strive to be impartial evaluators. It's very legitimate to describe that person and their personality characteristics based on the outcome of your assessment, but you have to monitor your own values and perceptions. So let's say you are Christian, very much involved in your faith, and the person in front of you is Muslim, right? You can't let your opinion of that faith come into play as you're making that decision. You have to say, okay, if I didn't know anything about their religion, what would I decide? Again, unless that religion is somehow part of, unfortunately, of every faith. We've seen this with, you know, Jewish, Muslim, Christian. I mean, I don't even know what to call cults, right? They're like not really anything, even though some of them claim to be one of the mainstream religions. But people of any faith can be extremists and abuse children as in the name of their faith, right? And so that's the only time you would take this into account, right? Psychologists strive to engage in culturally informed, non-discriminatory evaluation practices. That's really important. people from different cultures have different ideas about parenting, will understand the questions you're asking them in different ways, right? And so you need to make sure that you're not putting cultural bias in things that make someone look bad because they're from a different country or a different ethnicity, right? This is a really important piece of this. Psychologists also strive to avoid conflicts of interest and I just lost my place for a second, and multiple relationships. So you cannot be the therapist to any member of the family and then also do the custody eval because you're biased. Because whoever is your client, you're going to be more in favor of them. So it should be a separate person who does this eval, who establishes the same level of relationship, meaning evaluator, evaluatee with all members of the family. You should never, ever, ever do any kind of assessment like this for a friend or a family member. Not only is that just going to probably ruin your friendship, right? But it's a conflict of interest. It's really problematic. And this is actually the most common violation of the APA ethics code in general, not just in this area. And this can be really hard to do if you live in a small community. So let's say you live in an area where, there's a population of 1,000 and maybe you're the only psychologist in the area, right? And so if you're their therapist, then you have to try to contract out to someone next county over maybe. And now we're getting, because of COVID, we're getting good at like tele-assessment. And so maybe that would become easier in the future to avoid these conflicts of interest. Psychologists strive to establish the scope of the evaluation in a timely fashion, and that they make sure that scope is consistent with the nature of the referral question. So the referral question is, who should have custody of this child, right? And so you then always want to include the parents and the kids. Both parents, or if there's step parents, you include them, right? And the kids. But then sometimes you want to include others. Is there a nanny or an au pair in the house? What insight do they have? Again, are there grandparents, aunts, uncles who might be better qualified to take care of this child or in a better place financially, mental stability-wise, what have you? So it's really best that if everyone you will evaluate is court-ordered to do so, because then that means they have to do it or they're in contempt of court. And typically judges will know this and make that so, essentially. Psychologists strive to obtain appropriately informed consent. It's best to have an actual signed consent form. And you have to tell people exactly what the process is going to entail. You also have to tell them, as we've talked about with other assessments, who's going to get this information. And explain to them, you are not my client, right? My client is whoever hired me, typically the court system, right? So they are going to get this information. Psychologists strive to employ multiple methods of data gathering. You want to not just do an interview, but also do assessment tests, record review, observations of the family, by sort of cross-checking, having checks and balances that allows for verification of what you find on one. Psychologists strive to interpret data in a manner consistent with the context of the evaluation. Again, here's where you need to take into account things like cultural factors, things along those lines. Psychologists strive to complement the evaluation with the appropriate combination of examinations or assessment instruments. Psychologists strive to base their recommendations, if any, if they're allowed to give recommendations, right, on the psychological best interests of the child. That's what all recommendations should be there for. And then psychologists will create and maintain professional records in accordance with ethical and legal obligations. So essentially, you should document everything, write it down. In this day and age, if you can record everything, that's also really helpful. All right, so you've got this eval assigned to you by the court. Everybody's court ordered to come talk to you. What do you need to do? So your steps. First, you want to evaluate the child's needs. And then you want to evaluate the relevant characteristics of parents and other significant adults in the person's life. Those that bear on the parent's capacity to meet the needs of a particular child, right? If this person just like is annoying, that shouldn't factor in, right? As much as it might seep in. But it should be, you know, can this parent's characteristics help them meet the needs of this child? And then you want to match the child's needs and capacities to the significant others in their lives to meet the child's needs. And again, this is the really hard part. Sometimes it's the lesser of two evils with the parents. And again, sometimes it's neither parent. Sometimes this is going to be the grandparents or aunt, uncle, what have you. I mean, sometimes it's going to be neither parent and they're going to the foster care system, right? There are times where that's safest for the child. So what sources of information do you want to use? You want to interview everyone who has a relevant role. The kids, the parents, interview folks like their teachers, their therapists, things like that via phone. Then you want to do an observation in your office, typically for practical reasons. Parents, of course, will know they're being observed and be on their best behavior. But that being said, they're often still not able to hold it together even in this short time when they know they're being watched. So this can still give you a lot of good information about how they interact with the kid. And so based on your observation, you're going to form impressions of the parent-child interaction. Then you're going to look at their records. So what are their school records? How's this kiddo doing in school? You know, if they have, you know, a therapist, you get those records. If they have medical records, like again, in the cases of abuse, right? Documentation of broken bones without explanation, things along those lines. You want to review that. You know, any legal documents associated with the court case. Everything that's relevant should be reviewed within the limits of the time you can spend on the evaluation. What Jack told us is that what he would do was limit what he would look at from parents. So he would say, okay, each of you can give me 10 pages of documentation, but that's it, to try to keep things fair. And these will often be records of what the other parent did. Right. So he found it helpful to limit those, and then again, to make sure they're equal across the two parents, that both have the opportunity to do that. The main key with these, again, to try to maintain that impartiality, is to treat everybody the same as much as possible. And then you're going to do psychological testing. And interestingly, even though, again, you're a psychologist who's probably pretty well trained in assessment at this point, right? These are actually the least important source of information on these evaluations. If you do these, it's often the MMPI for the parents. And about 84% of child custody evals in one study used the MMPI or other personality tests. So on something like the MMPI, you need to be aware of test-taking attitudes, especially defensiveness. So both parents want the child, or they wouldn't be going through this custody battle, right? So they're each going to try to present themselves in the best light possible. So it's so common to be defensive and to try to present yourself in the best light that if you don't, that might be a red flag. Like, why isn't this parent trying harder to make themselves look good, right? Maybe they don't actually want custody, or maybe they're so disturbed mentally that they don't pick up on the fact that they should be presenting themselves in the best way, right? So you need to kind of take that into account. Because of this, the MMPI-2 has specific norms for custody cases on things like the validity scales, where you're looking at defensiveness and positive self-presentation. So you should compare your client, your assessee's scores to norms for child custody evals. I believe when I took the workshop on the MMPI 3 in November, someone asked about this and they said, you know, they're still working on getting these norms, but they anticipate they will exist for that version as well. The fact that there's a limited research concerning the MMPI and parenting is something that should really be taken into account. So the MMPI is going to tell you about the parents individually, right? What is their mental state? How are they trying to present themselves? But we actually don't know very much in general about how psych evaluations predict or don't predict effective parenting. So that's something important to keep in mind that obviously makes these challenging. So these are some of the relevant characteristics that you're going to be looking at as you do these evaluations. And one thing that's really important to note is that none of these preclude custody. Just because one of these exists doesn't mean that parent can't have custody. Again, it's going to always be about parent-child match, right? So mental retardation is actually an old term. Now we tend to use intellectual disability or developmental delay. Again, that doesn't preclude them, but if it's to the point where the parent can't operate on their own, right, you just need to kind of take that into account. And is there someone else around who can help? Substance abuse, you want to look at things like the severity of the substance abuse. Are they getting treatment? And then sometimes you just have to compare to the other parent, right? Well, like, okay, so this person drinks on the weekends, but the other parent is doing meth every day, right? And then serious psychopathology. So basically this is like, here's what the parent is like clinically, and how does that match with the child's needs? And something like depression or anxiety wouldn't necessarily be problematic unless it's so severe the parent like can't get out of bed, right? But if the person is actively psychotic, right, and is hearing voices, again, it doesn't necessarily preclude them, but we need to make sure those voices aren't telling them to like hurt the child or something along those lines. However, all this being said, if it's a very significant problem, the court will usually figure it out without doing a psych eval. Like if someone is actively hallucinating in the middle of the courtroom, they're not going to be like, psych, tell me if this person is psychotic. They're going to know, right? So that's important to know. And then in terms of relevant personality characteristics, sometimes people, talk about these being good versus bad parenting characteristics. It's really sort of good versus not good. Different things are going to work for different people. So experts on parenting would include these in their descriptions of effective parents. So the capacity to give and receive love. Empathy, so being able to put yourself in the other person's shoes and understand why they might be struggling. Emotional maturity, so can the parents put the child's needs before their own if necessary. Structure, so can they set limits with the child? Can they set rules and then enforce them? Right, kids do need that. There's actually some studies that showing when kids don't get that, their self-esteem actually is compromised. Flexibility versus rigidity. You don't want someone who's just all rules, right? You want to be able to sort of teach and help the child grow. And then judgment, in terms of like, can they judge what's sort of good and bad for a child? Impulse control. Frustration tolerance is one I don't have a bullet for, but is certainly on this list. So, can they sort of hold it in, right? Or are they going to lash out? And then self-esteem issues by the parent, right? Are they going to be looking for validation from the child, or are they confident enough in themselves that they could just parent? All right, so I have about 20 minutes left, so we'll go ahead and start talking about personal injury assessments. So these would often be lawsuits, workers' comp cases, things along those lines. So some definitions here. A tort is the civil wrong one commits against another. And with a tort, there's some remedy possible. So this is a legal claim or complaint, often in the form of a lawsuit. So let's say, I'll actually give you an example of a case Jack told us about. Guy was driving down the freeway, window company truck was in front of him. They hadn't properly secured the windows on the truck. So one bounced off and hit this guy's windshield behind them. As you can imagine, he suffered physical injuries and he also suffered PTSD as a result, right? So there's an example where a lawsuit might be raised. The plaintiff in this case is the injured party. They're asking the court to do something about this. The defendant is the accused. So notice we're using different language here than we use in criminal case, right? Because it is a different court system. And, it could be that someone's broken the law, but a lot of times, that's not as clear. And in fact, what we're not seeking is not for them to be punished criminally, right? But we're seeking some sort of essentially restitution or reparations for the harm done. So liability is determining if the defendant, again, the accused, was legally responsible for something that happened to the plaintiff, the person making the complaint, asking the court to do something. And the court is the one who makes the decision. The psychologist isn't involved in this stuff. This is beyond our expertise, right? When we get involved, it's already clear that the defendant has liability. So what we're getting involved with essentially is the damages. The damages are where you're going to do something to make right the wrongs done to the plaintiff. And typically this is in the form of compensation, and typically in our capitalist system, that compensation is monetary. And this is where psychologists get involved, because if someone is seeking damages for psychological and or emotional damage, someone who has knowledge about psychological and or emotional damage needs to assess it, right? So we have to link that psychological and emotional damage to whatever the plaintiff is complaining about. So in the case example I gave you, we have to say, the company didn't properly secure those windows, so they are responsible for this guy's PTSD. He didn't have PTSD before this happened. And that can be tricky in people who have pre-existing psychological conditions. So what are our assessment tasks for this type of evaluation, an evaluation for emotional or psychological damages? So we want to assess psychological functioning. So current, you want to look at how they're doing at the time you're asked to get involved. And we're specifically interested in distress that they're experiencing, psychopathology they may be experiencing, again, something like depression, PTSD as a result of whatever the incident was, Maladjustment. So are they having troubles going to work, for example? Is this causing them problems in other parts of their lives? If you do find problems, the court will want to know the extent to which they resulted from the actions of the defendant. So that's wordy, so I'll say it again. So let's say you find something wrong. The court wants to know the extent to which that problem resulted from the actions of the defendant. Okay. And oftentimes the defendant is, let's say, an insurance company. The defendant wants you to say you can't establish a link. Whereas clearly the plaintiff wants you to say you can establish a link. So just like something like a not guilty by reason of insanity assessment, now we're having to do retrospective assessment. We're having to do psychological detective work. And as we've talked about before, that's really difficult. You don't have good measures to measure how someone was doing, before a window flew off a truck at them 6 months ago, right? Honestly, these cases can sometimes take even longer than criminal cases, so it's pretty common for it to be years beforehand rather than months. So you try to reconstruct their life. You look at their psychological functioning from whatever data you can find at the time. So the psychologist becomes a detective, and they have to figure out possible ways that they can get information on this person. So what would you all guess are some of the ways they can get this information? And you can unmute or you can stick them in the chat. Like, who should they talk to? What should they look at? Close friends or families are going to, yeah, Jackie, I'll repeat the question. So you're assigned one of these cases, you have to become a psychological detective and reconstruct what happened, what the person was like before the incident. So who are you going to have to talk to? What sort of information are you going to look at to try to get that information, to try to piece that together? So yeah, Annika said close friends or family, definitely, right? The victim themselves, very important. Him, yes, definitely. Yeah, friends and family could definitely be beneficial. They're the people closest to this person. Ooh, Annika, that's a really good point. Social media now, right, is almost like a diary for a lot of people, right? It sort of gives us a nice look at something like that. Past therapists, yes. So if they had a therapist, you want to get access to those records, especially if they've had previous psychological evaluations. That's like gold, because then you compare their scores then to their scores now. Yeah, they're online friends, people they might have been chatting to on Reddit or what have you, right? Who might know them maybe even a little better than people in their day-to-day lives. Yeah, y'all are coming up with some really good ideas here. Let's see, the other things. I guess this would fall in like friends and family, but neighbors, right? Who might have seen their comings and goings. I don't know about y'all, but like I've gotten to know my neighbors a lot better because we've been outside a lot more because our daughter just wants to be outside during COVID. Yes, Sherelle, old bosses or coworkers is a really good one too. Yeah, employers, right? What were they like at work? Did their ability to function at work change following this, right? That's a huge one. This is, one of the classic cases we talk about in psychology is Phineas Gage, the guy who got the railroad rod like through his brain. And that was one of his problems, is his personality changed, so his ability to do his work as a foreman changed, right? So these are really important things to ask. So I think you guys hit on everything. Yep, plaintiff, employer, family, neighbors, records. So yeah, if they were in school at the time, maybe looking at their school records and did that change? Looking if they get like performance reviews at work, did those change afterwards? Things along those lines. Really good, y'all. And another thing to point out is just because they may have had psychological issues before this happened, right? If they were seeing a therapist, if they, did have anxiety, what have you, that doesn't mean the incident didn't cause additional damage. So your job is to see whether there is essentially something added on that wasn't there previously because of the incident. You have to be careful as you do this because there could have been impairment right after the incident, but again, it could be years later. So due to the time elapsed before the evaluation, it may no longer be present or as obvious. So let's say you had a head injury and you had some cognitive issues, and just over time that has gotten better as your head injury repairs, or maybe you're doing speech therapy and things along those lines. And clearly you don't want to tell the person, don't go to therapy until we get through your lawsuit, right? But sometimes, unfortunately, that can work against people. So what has the course of their psychological status been from the time of the incident until now? That's really what you're looking at. And it could be impaired for some period of time, even if it's in full remission now. And that doesn't mean that just because they're doing okay now, you don't have, some liability, right? Especially, again, if it causes problems in work, their ability to provide for their families, things along those lines. You want to look at the nature of the incident or incidents. Sometimes there's more than one that are alleged to cause the damage. People will readily talk about this one. This is pretty easy to get people to talk about. And then you need to look at it in terms of like how distressed were they compared to how distressed an average person might be in the same situation. And you want to get as much data as possible that will help determine if the distress is attributable to that incident in particular. Again, this is the hardest part and the most important part, is trying to piece together, is what they're experiencing now or what they experienced before due to the incident. Then you want to look at the cause-effect relationship, and that obviously goes with what we were just talking about, between the current deficits in functioning or the previous ones if they've gotten better, and the incident or incidents, right? Again, there could be multiple. You want to be able to give an opinion with psychological certainty that the deficit was caused by the incident. So you consider pre to post functioning, as you all were saying, talking to all these people who knew the person before and after. Again, particularly if they already have a therapist, something like that, that can be really, really helpful. You need to consider any other incidents that happened to them in that time, right? So maybe this guy had this car crash, but then later he also had a stroke, right? Well, if he's asking for damages due to like cognitive issues, that's going to be really hard to pick apart. You need to consider alternative explanations and hypotheses as well. You essentially treat this as you would going into an experiment, right? Like, what are all the possible explanations for this? This is how, if you are called to testify, you will be attacked by the attorneys as well. How did you know that? And what about this, right? So you need to kind of be prepared for all those contingencies. You want to demonstrate in testimony that your hypotheses make more sense than anything else, right? Well, it's not the stroke, right, that caused him to have PTSD. It's like, that wouldn't cause it. This would. You will be asked to assign probability values to your judgment. We can't do that as psychologists. We just don't have advanced enough models to be able to do that at this point in time. So psychologists asked to testify in these cases should stand their ground and say, I can't provide that. The limitations of my science mean that I'm unable to provide that. You can say something like, it's highly likely that my explanation is true, but you can't assign like it's like 90% likely. You just can't do that. So this can be difficult if you're looking something specifically like workers' comp, or for veterans, what we call a service connection. So if you're not familiar with it, essentially it's like percent disability. And if you are service connected for anything, your care for that thing is covered totally by the VA. So, you know, let's say you're service connected for tinnitus because a roadside bomb went off and you have tinnitus as a result, right? Your care for your tinnitus is going to be covered. That doesn't necessarily mean your care for like depression would be covered, right? But if you're service connected for your depression, and they can say, yes, this happened because of what happened to you in the service, then yeah, you can get that covered. And anyone who is 100% service connected for any reason, it's all their care taken care of. So what is the prognosis? This is also something you'll be asked to comment about. Does the person actually need treatment? And if so, how long will it take? What will the cost of said treatment be? And will that treatment actually help, right? So malingering is another thing you really want to look out for. So remember, malingering is faking bad. There's a strong motivation to do so, right? Let's say you're in a $1 million lawsuit. There could be some motivation to fake or at least exaggerate, right? These will almost always be an issue you have to address. Even if the person is totally telling the truth, we've got to rule it out, right? So the fake bad scale, the FBS of the MMPI, was developed specifically to identify people who were malingering in personal injury cases. So it is developed for this purpose. So it is one of your best tools here. One of the things, though, is it doesn't work that well, if at all, in identifying emotional malingering. It's more likely related to genuine distress. And it's great for the defense. They can try to use it. So you kind of had to, part of your job as an expert witness would be to educate the triers of fact about it. And in these cases, there could be juries. All right, so I'm going to stop there just because the next slide, I'd rather do it all at once. But that gets us a nice start, at least, to talking about how we do these assessments in civil contexts. So I'm going to stop share and go ahead and